Hey, this is Alex Sammon. I'm a staff writer here at the American Prospect, and we are having our November, December issue event. I've got three great writers here who have pieces in the issue: Rachel Cohen, Tkacik, and Lee Harris, each of whom have written, I think, really fascinating pieces for the print. And we're going to have, a kind of quick and informal discussion, I think, about some of the things that come up in their pieces. I think it'd probably be best if we just go around quickly and have each of the three of you give a quick summary of what you wrote about, and then I think if we go from there, I mean, obviously there are a couple of things that stood out to me in reading your guys' work, and I think there's some interesting threads that I'd like to ask you guys about, and yeah, and hopefully we can just riff from there and see how it goes. But do you want to? I mean, I'm happy to just call you guys off based on the way you're oriented on the screen here. But Rachel, do you want to go first, and then Mo, and then Lee, and then talk about your piece quickly, and then we'll get into it?
Sure. Hey guys. So I wrote a story. It was called The Democratic Dark Money Dilemma, or something similar to that. I don't have it in front of me. And I basically went on this lengthy effort to try to answer questions about, like, what does it mean that even our most progressive groups on the left, and certainly our liberal, center, and democratic groups now kind of relatively unabashedly accept dark money meaning money we don't know who's giving it, undisclosed money. There was, a time a decade ago where that was something we, charged the right with doing, that we said we wanted to crack down on. Now, there still are bills to sort of nominally get rid of it, but the sort of political infrastructure that has developed around outside of it, our campaign apparatuses, our consulting firms, our advocacy groups, they all now really benefit and thrive on this like massive infusion of money that where donors don't need to disclose. And so I wanted to kind of understand, like, what does that mean for the decisions the groups make? Why, how did that shift happen? What else is happening with transparency? Because turns out that, like, as this was going on, the courts have actually been weakening our other requirements for financial disclosure. So we're sort of at this path where we're getting further and further away, although, like, on the surface, you'll still find people saying, oh, well, we support HR1, and that would bring back disclosure, and that's still on the agenda. So, I mean, the piece is long. It's a little hard to sort of summarize in a quick way. But, I think it, I was sort of interested in a couple of main questions, like, if the laws, like, I was essentially kind of interested in this question of, like, what does it mean to be so deferential to donors who don't want to share their names, and, like, why do we do that?
Cool. Yeah, it's a really fascinating piece. Thanks so much, Rachel. Mo, do you want to hop in?
Sure. My piece is called Built to Lie, just a takeoff of Built to Last, which was one of the preeminent business Bibles of the 90s. And it was this book that really spent a lot of time lionizing Boeing as sort of the apotheosis of a company that was built to last, that the highest level, kind of highest class American management. So there's a new book out on Boeing, pegged to the well, it's mostly about the 737 Max crashes and groundings, and what that ordeal showed America about this once very revered company. And I'd spent a lot of time on this topic. I had written about it for the New Republic. And so it's just basically, the story is my chance to return to the scenes of that crime, and as so often happens with these things that, you know, are absolutely totally infuriating in the moment, and there's a lot of good reporting done, and you know, there's a lot of good hearings held, and there are some really hard-hitting investigations, and you know, everything is written up in extremely you know, outraged prose, and then you know, people move on, a year passes, and in the meantime, while everybody kind of took their eyes off, and in Boeing's place, you know, it was like the entire company, you know, sort of pivoted from that crisis to the COVID crisis. So it was that was, you know, for everyone involved, even on the Boeing, like even people who are following Boeing, you know, took their eye off that ball for a while, and as usual, everything just got worse. Nobody ended up. There's been like negative accountability, I feel like, and they're about to. They have indicted, and there will be a criminal trial. It's scheduled for it's scheduled for February, although I don't know. They're about to hold accountable this like low-level pilot who's just a complete patsy. And meanwhile, you know, there was this unbelievable deferred prosecution agreement. I mean, just corruption layered upon corruption. Sorry, that's my 3-year-old who has COVID. But yeah, that's it's not a fun tale. It's just a story about lying. It's very much like the Sackler Purdue Pharma story, where, you know, it just kind of like the impunity gets more and more elaborate, and more, you know, like at some point the deep state has to kind of pivot from sort of just looking the other way, and you know, and quashing investigations, to actively sort of conspiring on behalf of the murderers. So very uplifting pieces.
Thanks. And then Lee, do you want to talk about your piece quickly?
Sure, I'll make it speedy. So my piece is called "What the New Sheriffs of Wall Street Can Do," and it looks at this new crop of regulators that Biden has tapped to regulate Wall Street, financial regulators and bank regulators, and the set of people that he's brought in to head a number of kind of key agencies have gotten a lot of attention as serious critics of Wall Street and people who are really looking to get tough on industry. So there's, I think, probably most prominent among them is Gary Gensler at SEC, who is someone who originally came from Goldman Sachs, and Obama put him in charge of the CFTC, which regulates derivatives, and kind of expected him to play ball with banks, and he didn't. He really cracked down on derivatives and earned a reputation as a tough cop. And then there's also Rohit Chopra at CFPB, who's someone like a lot of financial regulators in this administration, who kind of comes out of the Warren tradition of being really skeptical of and tough on big tech. He already, in just the very short time that he's been in office, has been kind of both rhetorically and in practice getting really serious about fintech. So like consumer products that are repackaging banking and other bank-like services directly through people's phones. And he's really skeptical of a lot of fraud and abuse there, but also looking to crack down on kind of conventional banks. And an interesting claim that he's making is he wants to restore retail banking, I think he says, or direct banking in an era of big data, which, given the way sort of the headwinds are pointing, is going to be a battle for him. And then a third example is Graham Steele at the Treasury, who's been a major critic of climate risk and the way that that a lot of assets that are exposed to climate change, either regulatory risk or physical risk, that there's going to be kind of a big reckoning with that, and it's a potential major. It could be a kind of shock to financial markets when all that risk gets internalized. He's also been an advocate of antitrust action, including, for instance, against BlackRock. So all the, and then there's a kind of whole roster of people lower down in positions at these agencies that are kind of quietly bringing a more radical approach to financial regulation, all to the good. At the same time, that's counterbalanced by a number of staff members who've been pulled from the Fed, which is kind of seen as institutionally conservative, and just by the general inertia and industry friendliness of bank regulation and financial regulation. So there's reason to be bullish about where FinReg is headed, and also reason to be cautious. The piece also looks at a number of debates kind of among progressive regulators over the right way to regulate banks. So for instance, with a lot of really huge non-bank financial institutions like major asset managers, there's a kind of lively debate over whether the better strategy is to apply some kind of antitrust policy and break them up, or to treat them like utilities and call them too big to fail and designate them as SIFIs or systemically important financial institutions, is I think the term. So so there's definitely a lot of activity, but and enthusiasm. But so far in this first year of the Biden admin, we haven't seen where it's headed, and I try to lay that out in the piece.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Yeah, so obviously a lot of stuff here, I think, for us to draw on. I think all three of these pieces are really fascinating and great. The kind of first thing that listening to you guys talk about this stuff and having read it, kind of the first thing that comes to my mind, and maybe we'll kind of work backwards on this, but Mo, for you, Lee, and your piece, Mo, is it seems like both of these things are kind of stories of crashes and their aftermath. And we obviously have the great financial crisis in 2008, and the aftermath of that is kind of the prelude, I think, to your piece, Lee. And then obviously, Mo, the crash with the Boeing saga is much more literal. And I think that I think you could argue that both those things kind of followed a similar trajectory. To some point, you have this sort of state collaboration where, in the case of the financial crisis, you have these state actors like HAMP basically collaborating to cover up for the banks or to facilitate what's essentially fraudulent activity. And then in the case of Boeing, where it already gets so much of its funding from federal contracts and all this stuff, and as you pointed out, Mo, you have basically the collaboration of the state to cover up the most grievous parts of their sort of criminal activity. And then I think what really interests me is what comes next. And would be curious to hear what both of you guys think about this. If, Lee, it seems like you're kind of suggesting that the regulations that came out of the financial crisis actually may have made the banks a little safer, but then also cleared the way for this incredibly unregulated sort of shadow banking world. And I don't know if that's a success or a failure of that sort of post-crash moment. And then Mo, the post-crash moment you're talking about seems like a much more kind of straightforward, there will be no remorse, there will be no accountability. I'm curious, I would love to hear you guys kind of talk about what you think about those crashes and sort of how crashes have kind of set the tone for this moment that we're in terms of greater accountability or sort of the climate we're in going forward.
Do you mind if I just,
Go for it.
because I think about this a lot. I mean, I covered the financial crisis when it was happening. And one thing that impressed me about the Boeing, the crashes of the 737 MAX, is that there are a lot of really good aviation reporters, and there's a lot of people. You have to know what you're talking about to cover that company. It's incredibly complex products. So there's a really impressive and formidable stable of reporters covering the MAX. I don't think that if the reporters had been it like, and I'm talking about reporters who've been covering Boeing for like 20, 30, 40 years in some cases. So if that hadn't existed, it's hard to know what exactly would have happened to Boeing, because basically it was the reporting that really drove the investigations and the lawsuits, and the subpoenas. And it laid out pretty quickly that Boeing had, created this software that, very, very directly, very quickly caused these planes in, when there was a malfunction of a single sensor to dive into the ground essentially. And so it was just this shocking thing. But Boeing seemed to proceed along that, along the lines of, maybe we can kind of like push this under the rug or whatever. And, meanwhile, there was all this reporting like, no, everything that Boeing says is a lie. This is like provable. I don't know anything about engineering or, being a pilot. And yet it was very, just, reading all of the reporting that was coming out on this, it was pretty easy for me to kind of make, heads or tails of the situation, right? So there was this really great reporting, and I felt like the reporting was much better. Like the journalism about the 737 MAX crashes was like far superior to the reporting on this much bigger event of the financial crisis. I felt like the ratio of solid fact-based reporting to it's a propaganda was just like, so far weighted in the corner of fact, which was really astonishing, because watching the financial crisis, it was so easy when that was happening to get just carried away with rebutting all of the, everything that came out of Tim Geithner's mouth, or everything that, Sorkin wrote, or everything that, there's so many, even the good reporters, even reporters who are sort of on the side of good, that I think like, ended up sort of, they like, participating in layers of the financial crisis that were basically, misinformation based, like, oh, AIG actually didn't cause it, as it turns out, like Citigroup caused it. Okay, it took me a really long time to figure that out. So and the thing is that, but there's a memory of when Boeing was an amazing company. They make these products that have a million parts to them. That is really hard. And so even though they've been run like a Ponzi scheme for the past 25 years, and that is, by the way, like the sort of business model of most of the old economy, it's either a SoftBank like monopoly, right, or it's it's basically going in the direction of the Ponzi scheme. And what I mean when I say that is that the shareholders are taking out the money, they're floating bonds or whatever, that to pay themselves dividends, to pay themselves to buy back stock. They're using the company's money to do that before they actually bring any of the money in. And that's a thing that, Boeing is right now a zombie, technical zombie company. They have been, their interest expenses exceed their cash flow. So they spend more servicing their debt than they are actually bringing in. It's not a very good recipe. And so they have to keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. And that, that's partially a result of the the dramatic slowdown in business travel. But so like the thing about the financial system is that I don't know when the last time it was like when it wasn't a Ponzi scheme. And everybody who covers aviation remembers when Boeing wasn't a Ponzi scheme. It can't entirely be that even now, because they still have to, you know, make these things that have a million parts. With the financial system, was so interesting, and I'm, you know, so glad you quoted Sheila Bair in your story. When she finally wrote her memoir of the crisis, and it came out, I think, in like 2012, so, you know, like a good 4 years after, the way that she describes Glass-Steagall, and the institutional structure of the FDIC, it's really, it's so clear that she has so much respect for, and it gives the reader so much respect for the design of that, of the Glass-Steagall era of banking regulation, because they knew that the designers understood how the plumbing worked, and they understood how to design a banking system that didn't function like a Ponzi scheme, that wasn't, you know, just a vehicle for speculation. And but, you know, we've been, you know, chipping away at that since like the 70s, since the kind of advent of the money market mutual fund and the kind of the shadow banking. So it's hard to know with banking, like, where is the Ponzi scheme going to like reveal itself? Where is the fraud revealing itself, I guess?
I mean, I try
Sorry.
to raise, no, I just going off that, I try to kind of raise that question and definitely unsuccessfully answer it in my piece, but I kind of a founding like tension in my piece is, yeah, as Alex introduced it, this question of where the new shadow banking is, as it were. So like if in 2008, the shadow banks were on Wall Street, right? They were these broker dealers which weren't subject to any of the same prudential regulations, any of the regulations that banks have to comply with. They had copied the bank business model, in some cases had the same names as Wall Street banks. And then in this kind of act of massive regulatory arbitrage, leveraged themselves up and blew the, you know, and then proceeded to blow up themselves. That's a very Wall Street bank centric story that we all are familiar with now from 2008. And we missed it at the time.
Right.
And as Alex said, like in the wake of that, I argue that, you know, Wall Street banks do have a number of new guardrails put on them, and you might think the capital requirements are inadequate, or that, you know, just there are new forms of regulatory arbitrage that have emerged where new financial institutions have found ways not to, like, to evade those capital requirements. But I do think Dodd-Frank is like a kind of partial success story, and some of the risk has migrated elsewhere. But then the question you're left with is like, okay, where's the new shadow banking if banks have been made relatively safer? And I think there are a lot, like, people have lots of answers to that. There's still lots of risk in euro dollar markets overseas, which contributed to the 2008 crash. But one place that people seem to point to is stable coins and cryptocurrency and other forms of fintech that also, stable coins in particular, copy the business model of banks without having to comply with many or sometimes any of their regulations. So, but yeah, I wonder, one question back to you, Mo, is where was the good journalism in 2007, 2008? Like, do you think that, like, within the, like, specialist technical financial reporters, not at the big newspapers, but I don't know, like, were industry trade journals reporting well on MBS, or like, if you were going to find good reporting on derivatives and repo markets in like 2007, where would you have found it?
I am, you know, it's funny. I think that, like, I'm trying to kind of remember. I mean, so Bloomberg was probably where you got the most, the savviest. Bloomberg's probably where you saw the, and part of that is just like Bloomberg reporters have access to Bloomberg terminals. They know what fixed, you know, how to look at fixed income. They were able to look inside a CDO, and you know, nobody else was. So I think that Bloomberg, and there were, you know, two reporters, one of whom died in 2009, but they sued the Fed. I'm friends with one. I think that he just got laid off, Bob Ivory, and they had to fight like hell, their, Washington bureau to run most of the stories that they ended up running about it, because they had, again, they were kind of outnumbered. And that's one thing that was sort of shocking. I remember I moved to Washington in like 2010, and I couldn't believe how totally, I don't know what's a normal word for cucked. They were so just like they were complete stenographers for the Geithner point of view. And that's when I understood, like, I didn't understand where Tim Geithner got his power over the narrative, or why anybody would pay attention to him. And then I realized that, he had this whole kind of like crew of young reporters who didn't know anything, who believed him when he talked about, or didn't have the confidence to ask the stupid questions. So I think that that's where the good reporting was. But again, like, I still think, like, I remember years after the fact kind of going back and trying to figure out, exactly what happened, because at every step of the financial crisis, there was like a step of damage control. The first time, they, like, I guess, they basically realized that there's this stuff called asset-backed commercial paper, and it was in money market funds, and asset-backed commercial paper facilities were buying super senior CDOs. And like, there was this moment in like early 2000, or like early 2007, when it all started to sort of like unravel. And it started with these like Bear Stearns hedge funds, but it was really like this very, very strange, and they were still issuing CDOs at that point. So one thing that was always frustrating to me as a journalist was that, there were like $1 trillion worth of CDOs issued after October 2005, when basically these securities were inherently fraudulent, because the housing market was falling. So there was no way that like it's kind of getting into the weeds, and sorry to do that, but like there was all this like very obvious fraud that was committed. And yet if you went to DC, you like walked into a bar and everybody is convinced themselves in 2010 that nothing illegal happened, that there was no actual fraud. And that and that's because there was no regulation, and there was just this like massive campaign to bail out. And there's so many things that, if they had done principal reduction, right, if they'd done mortgage modification, if they had done any of the things, cram down, if they'd taken any of the steps that progressives thought were like, well, this is, this makes sense, like, regardless, if you care about banks, or if you care about human beings, like, you would want, like, you don't want like a huge gratuitous foreclosure crisis, but that's what they wanted, because it distorted what had actually happened and where all of the fraud was. So we never actually understood. I mean, that's the thing, like, Dodd-Frank did make some serious necessary changes. We never really did understand, like, where the fraud was, like, how it kind of how it played out, like how one step of the crisis led to the other. It was just like the series of bailouts and assurances that started like in like kind of early 2007. And I think that like I think that like like Citigroup is like basically like maybe Michael Froman knows, like there's people, but I was so shocked reading Sheila Bair's book that like she didn't claim to understand what was going on. She just she understood what she didn't understand. So sorry to babble.
Mo, because I think that's actually a really good a point, and like a really good point to bring in some of Rachel's work, because obviously Dodd-Frank passes at a similar time that we have the Citizens United ruling at the Supreme Court. Like, those things happen, in fairly quick succession, and the sort of like question of getting to know becomes something that is no longer, both in sort of campaign finance, but also in sort of high finance. The getting to know question is one that it starts to kind of run away from us, and we don't really see that level of transparency in a lot of sectors. And so I think that, Rachel, I obviously in the beginning of your piece, you mentioned that Citizens United being this sort of, this sort of big point of departure. And I think, to me, it's crazy to think that 10 years ago, Democrats were running on that. Like that was part of the messaging, was Citizens United has to be overturned. And now it seems like, I think even in the last 3 years, we've had like an incredible whiplash of the orientation towards big money on just in terms of how it manifests in DC as a political force. And I wonder if, do you think that that's sort of a useful framework too, to apply to politics in this current moment, that let's sort of like the getting to know, the accountability, or even thinking of it from the reporter's perspective of, trying to track down where the actual money is and whose it is and where it went, has kind of just exited this arena altogether, or how does that register with you in your reporting?
Yeah, no, these were central questions, and I was trying to like take off I'm a journalist, so I'm biased towards information and disclosure hat as I was doing this. And like, when I was interviewing the like political operative campaign industry people, they would be like, Rachel, like voters just don't care about Citizens United, like that, voters just don't really care. And, they just want us to win and get stuff done and deliver to vote. Like that's sort of the line. And I think that's kind of the mentality in this town I live in, of like, you just, but like, I don't even think that's true. I think that is a soundbite, but like,
what Democrat cares about winning? I'm sorry.
Well, maybe, yeah, I know. But like, I was thinking, do you really think that like AOC's voters love her because, of her weekly like reports of, here's what we got done? Yes, they're good, but I don't think that's like where her like enthusiasm actually comes from. Anyway, I think that it's funny because as I was reporting the story, I like got public citizen mailers sent to that were like, we're like still gonna overturn Citizens United. So there's still like these public interest groups that are like sounding that drum. But I definitely think like, it's become something that people look at rather derisively, or like, oh, no way. Even though like, I totally remember when that was the major thing that everyone talked about, across the party. I think that transparency and disclosure often sort of like get held to like a standard they can't meet. So like, oh, will it like solve all the problems? No. And in fact, in the like world that Lee's writing about and Mo's writing about, like with financial markets and stuff, like there's a lot of studies that have come out that show like, all these corporate complicated exploitative contracts, they love if you just like sign a consent form and say like, oh, well, we told you, like we gave you notice of all this stuff. And so there's obviously ways in which transparency and disclosure can be used to get stuff through. And a really interesting sort of literature I was reading as I was doing research, David probably wisely cut it, but I can share it here, is like, while the financial disclosure world was kind of born out of this like good government progressivism from the 1910s and 20s, as in the second half of the 20th century, it was anti-state libertarians who really leaned into all of this. And it wasn't seen as such a conflict for a while. Like journalists, I think many of us even still think, oh, we can have both. We can have, you can have accountability and transparency and disclosure and better serve state aims. That's kind of the world like we live in. But then we're sort of also seeing like, in our current, like, let's look at critical race theory attacks, for example. It's, right now corporations file like 4/5 of all FOIA requests, and they like basically sap out all the agency, capacity. And right now you have conservative groups like flooding public school districts with all these FOIA requests so they can get hands on the curriculum. And it's not that it's necessarily bad, but it just sort of, FOIA sort of went from being it's now sort of used because we like it's a way to either stop regulation or halt or sort of like muck up agencies, you know, in a way that actually crowds out like journalists who maybe are using it for a different purpose than say a corporation. I'm getting off the top of your question. Let me go back to that. Sorry. I still think, and I finished it quite like reaffirmed in this project that like, it's like just, we talk all the time about a lack of trust in our politics and like distrust in institutions, and COVID made us distrust experts, and there's like all of these things going on. I really think that the flood of undisclosed spending where we just cannot know who is saying what messages and who is designing is extremely like has real it's making things worse. I mean, it was interesting. Last night I was asked to moderate a panel on like school board politics. It was hosted by an indivisible chapter in New York State, and they like convened an interesting group of people to sort of give context to these bills, and they wanted to talk about the role of school boards in like how these bills and school boards and how that all plays in. But it was really interesting because the hosts, and they're very nice, but you know, like the hosts and many of the audience members, they were really, really interested in talking about, oh, well, talk more about the dark money that's flooding into the school board elections from the right, like talk more about the dark money groups. And they kept saying that. And, you know, there are groups that have, you know, dark money groups on the right that are doing this, and you can point to them. But it was almost like there was no conception in their head that like their side of the aisle spends like so much, in fact, more in elections and dark money. Like, and I said to them, I was like, you know, conservatives came out the gate after Citizens United were spending more, but it's Democrats now in elections that do. And like advocates, like the Center for Popular Democracy has lots of astroturf groups, you know, like there's lots of, I would not be surprised if in 2022, there are dark money groups on the left in school board elections. I'm not even saying there shouldn't be. I'm just saying like, it was interesting to me that even in this setting where like they're here to talk about the politics, there was like no sort of conception that like, oh yeah, like liberals and progressives do this all the time in all these different contexts. And I think that probably your average liberal progressive person would like readily know Koch funded group. Like that's probably a phrase they've used. But they, you know, wouldn't know what the 1630 fund is, New Venture Fund, Arabella Advisors, all these constellations of Tides Advocacy. Like these are where the power centers are today. And I think like we haven't done as good of a job as we could have like making that clear.
I was wondering, I was just so struck by how in denial Democrats and liberals are about this fact. And you make that point super well in the piece. But I also wonder, so you have this line, or I guess a quote from a staffer in progressive movement building who says that the landscape is becoming extremely donor centric. And I guess just like to play devil's advocate for a second. Okay, so like if donors are progressive donors, they want to advance progressive causes, putting aside the like, you know, threat to democracy and the kind of process considerations, what's the harm in like a sort of donor-centric orientation as long as the donors have progressive goals?
Yeah, I mean, and this was I thought about this all the time. I was like, does it matter? Is this silly to be thinking like we are dealing with stolen election things? I guess I came in with a couple of observations, like not necessarily like full on like conclusions, but like, so for example, these funds like New Venture Fund, 1630 Fund, like, yes, they have like some progressive donors. You'll get like the Ford Foundation or like some of like Weiss money, but like it's also flooded with like Reed Hastings and Seth Klarman, and like there's it's sort of this conglomerate of money from all across the wing of people who like maybe are anti-Trump but actually have very different priorities, and we do not have any window into like, well, who is making the decisions of where that money goes? Like they recognize progressive is kind of like a useful umbrella that can like, you know, capture everything. So maybe they are funding like, oh, we're going to do voting rights. And you're like, okay, that's fine. Like, yeah, okay. Like I have no problem. Sure. But it's like, I think it's like, understanding that there are like these vehicles that are saying, oh, we're just gonna like, actually here, the Hub Project is another one. I don't know if you've heard of them, but like, I tried to find out like, okay, so what is the hub project's like priorities? Like their big thing, one of their big things is like the tax march, it's like, I don't know, it's just like a really weird, I think it's, I guess to better answer your question, well, there's two things. One, I think it's really hard to evaluate like how progressive, what they're actually doing. Like we don't even know who's like working at the sort of organizations they set up. It's just kind of like, or maybe we know like their name, maybe they have a nominal website with no staff members listed and they say like, oh, we're working to like advance racial equality or something like, I think it's really just hard to know and assess and evaluate if this money is actually going to progressive causes or if it's like being under the banner of progressive cause, but like maybe it's all like, I mean, not to like wade into a like minefield, but like, for example, like, oh, charter schools, you could imagine a lot of money from the new venture fund going to charter schools and then them saying, oh, we're advancing progressive causes. And then it's like a debate. Some people think that is, some people think it's not. And I think the other thing I wanted to add was, oh shoot, damn it. Doesn't matter. I'm trying
Can I just ask?
Yeah. I'm gonna try to remember what I was gonna say.
Because so to me, I don't know. I haven't read your piece and now I feel so stupid, but it's
Okay.
the whole like COVID thing. But you like looking at the electoral dynamics from a mile away. I remember back in like 2013, 2014 or something, I had to do something on the DCCC and I was like, holy shit. They just want to lose. Like all they spend money on is trying to make sure that the good anyone who has like a grassroots following, anyone who's got a populist message, anyone who's got any chance of winning in a shit cycle just doesn't make it, and that they have these like kind of plastic candidates that they would promote and they would and so that's one thing is like I don't feel like, especially after having watched the because I am still registered in Virginia, so having been assaulted by emails throughout the gubernatorial campaign that just happened, like it seems like these people are so committed to not necessarily to losing, but making sure that no populist Democrat, that nobody who would care about money in politics inter alia ever makes it through. It seems so obvious that is the goal of the donor class.
I don't think that like, I guess I didn't come away with like thinking like that is necessarily the objective, because I think actually one thing that struck me was like how all of our like progressive advocacy groups do this too. I guess the one thing I wanted just to add, but that I forgot before, was I think a major sort of like theme that came away from this, and I guess we might get to this later, but just in case we don't. So the major argument that has been used is like, well, we can't unilaterally disarm. The stakes are too high. The right is spending all this money. Like we just cannot afford to not raise as much as we can. And so I like that makes sense on a basic level, but what became fairly clear is that like that logic can be used to justify literally anything and everything, and you can take that so far. It can be used, and from that vantage point, like anything that could make a donor at all uncomfortable, and then they take their money. Well, we can't risk that because we need to raise as much money as possible to fight. Like that's how it goes, and it's really toxic because it like then you can sort of at what point do you say, well, we're not gonna like even, and so I explored this idea of like
These
voluntary
same
exposure.
people.
What if you said, oh, we'll take all of your money, but like after a certain threshold, like after $15,000, like we'll take your money, but we're going to disclose. Oh no, but if a donor is upset about that and then we'll lose them, then we don't. So from I guess the point that I realize is like, if you accept this idea that if you won't even sort of do like a very like, frankly, like gentle, well, we're going to disclose at a certain point because you have rationalized, well, we can't risk not raising every single cent. Why would you expect those groups to push back on donors at any other point in the process beyond fundraising? Because there's so many points where a donor can be like, no, I don't like that, I'm going to pull my money on policy beyond just like disclosure. And so that is what I think is actually like quite alarming, because it just feels like we're becoming so deferential.
But what about just Hillary outraised Trump 2-1 in 2016? Like, what the fuck about that? Like, I'm sorry, like it makes me like the way that you're talking about what their like excuses, it's just so transparently disgusting. Like it makes my blood boil. I mean, you look at what happened. I mean, just go back to 2019 and think about how optimistic you might have allowed yourself to feel watching, those primary debates about how, oh, actually, maybe, our party actually gets what people care about. We're talking about, whether public option or single payer is better. We're talking about, like it was this period when, it looked like we were going to get, some kind of serious, again, like populist, we were going to see some return to like a populist platform for the party. And I knew when, Warren's like stupid bullshit about Bernie not thinking a woman could be president, when that dropped, I mean, there was so much bad blood between Bernie and Warren, and already I kind of felt like that was a sign that not everything was kosher, because it just seemed like obviously these two should have a pact, and they should just say, hey, like we'll pull delegates, like what, that would make sense. But they didn't do that, and they like they got torn apart, and then by the time like the primary is settled, by the time, March, like April 2020 roll around, everything populist has been taken off the table. And, we're at the point now where like, we're being told that like, Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg are the two, like those are options, like that's what we get. It's like there's no good faith anymore in this conversation.
Yeah, I wonder, Mo, I think that's an interesting point. I to my mind, like one of the kind of salient plot points of the 2020 election was that there was actually a real backlash on campaign finance in particular, where like at one point Bakari Sellers had this famous line about how like not taking super PAC money would be unilateral disarmament. There's no point, like you can't afford to do that. And then
right.
The Bernie Sanders campaign is funded by small donations exclusively and ends up raising more money than anybody else. And Warren does that too, right? And then there's this moment where she's on the road and she takes super PAC money. And then obviously Pete Buttigieg was a pioneer of taking that money and flouting the no super PAC pledge. And Biden, actually, I think Biden was the first to do it. And then you have Pete in the wine cave, and you have Kamala Harris cutting ads with the super PAC the weekend before she drops out. And so there was like this incredible backlash, or there was this, it seemed like there was a paradigm shift in terms of the relationship of the party to big money, and then it just snapped back so hard, and we ended up with a president who was the first person to violate that, and then the first two people to get jobs in the White House were Kamala and Pete, who were both also early abandoners of the no corporate money stuff. And I think that actually is a way of telling what has happened in the last year and a half that is kind of compelling. Lee, I see you wanting to chime in here. Do you want to weigh in?
Yeah,
also?
I was just going to say, I mean, to push back on I guess, drawing too much of a distinction between progressives or leftists and moderates on this. If Mo, if you get a chance to read the piece, I think you'll see, like, and Rachel made this point, but she points out that Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman also took tons of money from Justice Democrats, right? And even Bernie Sanders, right? I mean, you could make the point that Alex just made, that he raised all his money from small dollar donors. There's that famous map of his massive fundraising in really small checks. Or you could make the point the opposite way and point out that even he isn't exempt from needing money to be able to play, right? And it might be much better money and not dark money, but to the unilateral disarmament dilemma, no one seems to be able to get around the massive amounts of money that it takes to run a political campaign in America.
I know, but they waste it so much.
I guess the other thing to add, and I think this is where like so Teddy Schleifer, who writes for Puck, but he used to cover philanthropy for Recode. He had a piece like a week ago that I thought was really good, where he makes the point that the lines between philanthropy and politics have like basically been obliterated. And like that is this whole other dimension with like this C3, C4 thing that like is sort of like the implications of understanding that like conflation, and how you can have an entity with like a C3 arm and a C4 arm, and they lobby but they also pretend to be benevolent, charitable, and deduction groups, and like figuring out the ways in which that is playing out. I just think I think it's gonna be really hard to like put this all back in the bottle later. And I think there's sort of like this vague sense, oh, well, like we're just gonna like play the game as it's played now. And like, we have to do what we have to do. And voters don't really care anyway. And like, and I didn't finish the piece being like, I know how the world should work or like what we should do. But I did finish the piece with seeing the ways in which groups that I think like I would like to nominally trust make arguments that do not make sense to justify the status quo, so they can rationalize in their head, like saying, oh, well, yes, I support transparency, but if an ad running on TV about a bill, if it doesn't mention a candidate, that's not a political ad, stuff like that, like I think I felt disappointed by.
I wonder if we're getting really low on time, guys, and I'm sorry to even intervene because I feel like this is a really interesting conversation. To me, it feels like the sort of one of the things as well is that we have like this, there's kind of this old money, new money split, both in terms of fundraising and really in terms of finance, and the sort of like old money version, which is like the dial for dollars thing where you call your donors and then they fill you up, which is like the Joe Biden approach. It's very much like the reason someone like Kirsten Sinema is actually in good standing in the party is because she loves doing that, right? Like, and that's a very old-fashioned way of existing in this world. And then I think, Rachel, what you're kind of highlighting is a newer way where you have these philanthropic groups, and like the money comes in much bigger chunks, and you don't grovel for it the same way that like a classic sort of Senate person like Joe Biden grovels for it,
right?
And has historically. And then that's a really big sort of paradigm shift. And it seems like it came out of what could have been a very sort of compelling and populist and democratic shift, which is, people participating via small donation. Instead, we ended up with this other version of this, which is, I think is kind of perverse. And I think, Mo, as you wisely point out, ends up actually being even more expensive and having maybe even worse results. It's not even totally clear that it's worth it. And I wonder, this is going to just absolutely suck as a way of wrapping this up, but it seems like the old money, new money split is also a thing on Wall Street, Lee, and I wonder, I guess my question that I would love to put to all of you in the very few minutes that we have is I guess like how new is this new stuff? Like, should we think of this as new, or should we think of this as just like a continuation of the old stuff? And are things changing? And I don't know. Do you guys? Should we just go across? I mean, I don't know how to tie this off nicely, but I would love to get all of your thoughts one last time before we shut it down.
I'll go first. I think things are absolutely changing. I think there's been a really big shift, especially over the last 5 years. And I think we have not reckoned with it enough. And I think my piece only hit on a couple, like I am finished reporting this story with like, being like, wow, I have like 5 other investigations I wish I had time to do.
Cool. Mo, what do you got?
I don't think, well, No, I mean, everything just gets worse in the same way, right? One overarching theme that I feel like I always like end up concluding about Democrats versus Republican. It makes me wish that, you know, this whole like dialing for dollars thing, or it does make me long for old fashioned corruption, right? Like one thing that I felt so acutely during the Obama administration was that the Democrats didn't want to piss off anyone with money. Like they didn't want to piss off any of the banks. And if they were bought by any particular lobby, it would inevitably like be the worst one that existed, so that all of the behavior would just get excused. And it seemed like the Republicans were a little bit more surgical. And even though they were vastly more corrupt, they were also able to prosecute a white collar criminal here and there, or prosecute a whole company, or take down. They were also able to do that even while they were so corrupt, because they knew, like they actually brought in the checks. They knew who they'd taken checks from, and they knew who they could screw over. And I feel like with our side, it's like we don't have that kind of like savvy. Like we don't have we're not stacking favors, or, you know, we're not comfortable taking a check from somebody and then saying fuck you anyway, you know, I get to do this because I'm a senator now, you know, or whatever. And so we always end up, it is exactly what you said, Rachel. It's like you can excuse anything. Like if you have to, if you are trying, they almost feel it's almost like my expectation as to the conclusion of that, you know, that mentality of like, we can't leave $1 on the table, is like, well, you're not going to, you know.
It would be helpful if they said, we'll do things up to this point, but we're not going to cross that line. But they don't set that line. So
Or
that's
just
not
as
gonna work.
close. I like it's bananas. I don't know. But it clearly, I mean, it just feels like, oh, is this why AOC sucks now? Like, I'm not really that granularly. Is this why all of those people just suck? And they just like sort of seem like they've had some, you know, and I hate like, I hate that I participate in the, you know, sullying of the word woke, but like, you know, is this why everyone is so uniformly boringly woke now? Is it because all the money got to them? And it's like, it's hard to conclude anything else.
Sweet. Well, I have a less cynical note to end on, maybe, which is, to me, what Mo's saying is right, and it's like the story of Democrats versus Republicans, which is that Simpsons meme that's like, you know, Republicans were just plain evil, and then Democrats are we can't govern, we hate life and ourselves. And if that's pretty much the story, what I was trying to raise in my piece, which people should read, is there's a lot of enthusiasm for the regulators who have been picked for to be kind of watchdogs on Wall Street. Some of them are really good, and it'll be a litmus test of the Democratic Party whether they can actually pass some meaningful reforms. And a lot of them have written sort of great stuff on antitrust reform in particular, and they're interesting open debates about how to police Wall Street. So it's an area where I'm optimistic.
It's kind of interesting because if they don't succeed, that would, I mean, I'm hoping that they do, but if they don't, that would also sort of put, I think, the party in an, like, they would have to answer some hard questions. Okay, so what do you do next time? Because you're really poised. It's like you're shot to miss, or I just did that.
Right. The idea that like the party can't actually legislate, that legislation is an impossibility, and that all the sort of marginal benefit that having a Democratic administration would come from these sort of, you know, these sheltered appointees, and if they can't do anything, then you have a really, really heavy legitimacy crisis on your hands, because then you literally can't do anything. So Leah, it's all down to you.
Yeah, I would also say about that piece, like, yeah, definitely read Lee's piece, because it is like, oh wow, like they have assembled like a great lineup. It's like the antithesis of the Obama banking regulation team. So awesome. It is like, I hate to be so cynical, because, you know, that's not nothing. It could be the next crisis.
Yeah. That's true. This has been great, guys. Thank you so much for joining us and for a lively and spirited conversation.